Hello, everyone, and welcome to another week of CPA TV. And we have another episode of The Big Three for you. This week, Mihir is out. He is traveling to a big conference to discuss steel, and we should be hearing a lot more about that in the next coming weeks. But let's get on to the big three of the week. Number one is China's Phase 1 deal. The U.S. government has launched a new investigation onto China's Phase 1 deal, and this is really investigating whether China lived up to its main commitments. China promised huge U.S. purchasing and has delivered not a lot in this regard, and they've really failed every agreement they've made with the U.S. throughout all of our times and with every other country as well. Beijing has never ended its subsidies, they've never stopped dumping, and they've never halted any of the IP theft that has allowed them to really catch up in technology. This new probe isn't really about renegotiation with China. That's never going to work. It's about enforcing our own trade rules and ending an era of promises with China that they never live up to. The only measurable thing we can do is tariffs and import limits. Topic number two is the Section 301 investigation on medicine pricing. The U.S. has launched a new Section 301 investigation on foreign drug pricing. Foreign countries are paying far more for their drugs than the U.S. is, but these drugs often rely on U.S. research and development. Countries like Canada, Germany, Japan, they have drugs at a fraction of the cost of the U.S., but a lot of them rely on U.S. technology, whether it's vaccines, injectables, biosimilars, biologics. All of these things rely on U.S. technology, but we pay far more for them. We're paying for all the research for the entire world. And that's not free trade, that's export of our technology, and it has to end. Topic number three is a roundup of the Southeast Asia trade deals. The U.S. has signed deals with both Cambodia and Malaysia and has put in frameworks for Thailand and Vietnam. And this covers about 68% of Southeast Asian trade. And these deals are going to be a cornerstone of U.S. trade policy moving forward. A lot of these Southeast Asian nations have become a highway for Chinese goods to either transshipped or be transformed further and then come to the U.S. And so this new developing area is crucial to U.S. trade moving forward. And it's crucial towards our trade position with China. We have to leverage both against Chinese investment in these areas and transshipment and make sure that we actually make deals that are enforceable, not just creating another pathway for Chinese goods to be transshipped into the U.S. So that's the big three for this week, and let's get to it with talking about all three of them in detail. And back to topic number one, the China Phase 1 deal investigation. The U.S. has reopened an investigation into China's failure to meet its 2020 Phase 1 commitments. China missed over 40% of its pledged $200 billion in additional purchases of U.S. goods, but I think that this kind of ignores the point of what our trade relationship with China should be. Our relationship with China shouldn't be them buying goods from us. We really need to get back to be focused on making things in America, not exporting to China. China's never going to want to buy our goods. They're always going to want to just piggyback on our technology and export dump to the entire world. And so, Chuck, I wanted to ask you, what you think we should do differently this time around with the China Phase 1 deal, and what we should change about our trade relationship with China to make up for mistakes that we've made in the past?
Yeah, so I mean, Andrew, you're spot on, and I think CPA, that's what we'll be urging in this comment period. There's been a bit of drift. If you go to the agenda for and policy, and we just want to, if you go back to last year, what the president campaigned on. So Agenda 47 was the official campaign policy platform. Is what the president campaigned on. Put out these great videos, and on China for trade, the campaign promise was ending our economic reliance on China. And there was actually going to be a 4-year plan to get off of all essential imports. So that's direct. I'm directly quoting from what the president's plan was. That's not the same as in the statement put out by USTR last week, where the ambassador was talking about ensuring a reciprocal relationship with China, which that's not that's not what the president campaigned on, right? President campaigned on economic independence. And so you're right. We need to focus on that economic independence from China. And I think that what we should see is the Biden administration started to do this. So they started to get into they just tipped their toes in. But when we had the 4-year review of the 301 tariffs, which they finished late, so last year, because they came in 2018, so they're a little late. But around this time last year, what the Biden administration actually did was they picked some goods like electric vehicles and syringes, and they put those to 100% tariff. So good intent, right? Where we're like, look, we just don't want these things from China. We don't want cars from China, or at least electric cars, and we don't want syringes. So they took it to 100%. We need to see a lot more of that instead of just like going across the board and saying, well, we want to hit, 200 billion worth of Chinese exports at an extra 20% or whatever, or just any kind of across the board action like that. I think that that's what we don't want to see. And there is in one of in their request for comments, the last line actually says, "What comment on the appropriate aggregate level of trade to be covered by any additional duties?" No. I don't. I think what we want to start to take things. We want to do the work here. Let's start taking things product by product. And look, in fairness, the previous question does contemplate that. What action, if any, should be taken to address the level and scope of duties and products in China? So that's, I think, what we're going to do. Broadly speaking, I would suggest for USTR is, anything where we've got ample domestic capacity, let's get a protective tariff. So we've got CPA members, making barbecues. Barbecues, it's totally crazy. Charcoal barbecues, so like we got like 90% of them from China. We don't need any. This is a steel product, and it's we can make these at a competitive price here in the United States. We don't need them from China, so just shut that down. When I was in Costco last month, I'm seeing still Chinese barbecues, Chinese gun safes. So these are the most American things ever. Why are we still getting them from China this far out? So I think a lot of that, and of course, something we push a lot is, and the syringes are proof positive here, is that they need to start thinking more creatively. So even 100% tariff won't get it done. And as Andrew, you've done a ton on this, but in the context of medicine. But we saw this with syringes. So with syringes, we went to 100% tariff, and China's still our biggest supplier. Imports have gone down a little bit, so there's obviously been, I think they went down like less than 10% though, in the almost year since that 100% tariff went into effect. But that's one where it's like the unit cost is so low that even 100% tariff, if you're going from 8 cents to 16 cents, given China's overcapacity and just scale they operate at, it doesn't get the job done of reshoring. So I think that we start considering alternative tariffs beyond ad valorem to specific would be another good thing they can do in this 301.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And I think that with any trade deal we make, whether it's with China or any other country, the focus has to be on protecting U.S. producers in the U.S. market. I think that historically, this has been a focus on exports and what we can sell to the world, but people forget that exports are only 11% of U.S. GDP. 89% of our entire economy is domestic. It's imports that are competing with U.S. producers and stuff we make here on our own. And so really, this focus on exports is very misplaced. It's a small part of the U.S. economy, and we need to get back to the bulk of what makes our economy strong. And we also just need to remember that China has never abided by any of its trade agreements, and it never will, because their whole economic strength relies on subsidies and export dumping to the entire world. It relies on their chronic overcapacity that dumps products in the US, in Europe, in Southeast Asia now, and that's how they get their economic strength. They have every motivation to undermine any deal that they make, and we need to keep that in mind. And instead of making a deal with China or a lot of these other countries, Trump needs to keep in mind, as Chuck, you mentioned, his deal that he made with the American people in the election. And that's the number one deal he should be upholding. His deal to curb Chinese imports, to protect U.S. manufacturers, and get China's most favored nation status taken away. And that should be the real focus. And so I couldn't agree more. Moving on to topic 2 is the Section 301 investigation on foreign medicine pricing. USTR has launched a Section 301 investigation into foreign governments' use of drug pricing controls that undercut U.S. pharmaceutical producers. And the main takeaway here is that other countries unfairly get huge discounts on their medicine pricing, and the U.S. ends up having to pay for it. If you go to Canada, Germany, Europe, Japan, any of these countries where U.S. developed drugs are being sold, they're being sold for a fraction of the prices they're being sold here in the U.S. And there's a lot of reasons behind this, but one primary thing that is allowing these pricing to take place is that the U.S. pays for the research and development through NIH funding, especially which is directly taxpayer funded, and through companies and employers and workers here in the U.S. who are doing a lot of the research. And so this is really a broader fight into generic and medicine pricing across the world, and the realization that here in the U.S. we're paying a lot more and we get less for it. And in the meantime, a lot of our manufacturing is being sent overseas. And so, Chuck, I wanted to see if you had any other insights on this investigation or anything else that is being done in this space with medicine pricing that is good to know moving forward.
Yeah, so it's a big topic. I often, people talk about, well, what were, the early 80s or the 90s, and I in fact say, we lost our particular tariffs, in fact, back in the 1930s and 40s, for the most part. And offshoring takes a while, just like reshoring is going to take a while, but the bleeding really did start as far back then. But so what exactly happened in the 80s and 90s? What were the big events? It was the WTO Uruguay round agreements and the creation of the WTO, which what really happened then? Well, we already had the GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which wiped out our tariffs. But that was the last opportunity to try to get tariff reciprocity, I would say, with the rest of the world. We're giving the rest of the world total access to our market. We're just an open dumping ground, and they never lowered their tariffs under the GATT. But instead of trying to get reciprocity in the late 80s, early 90s, what did we do instead? We merged the GATT with this other international IP agreement called TRIPS. And the deal essentially was, look, we're going to let you continue to have unfettered access to our market, and we're not even going to ask for you to lower your tariffs. We're going to continue to accept asymmetry, but lack of reciprocity. But the one thing we want, but now you have to sign this other deal called TRIPS, which got married to the GATT as a single undertaking. That's the phrase. If you want any benefit, you have to agree to the whole package. And TRIPS basically had some very specific requirements on copyright, trademarks, and patents. And this was heavy stuff. My understanding is, even in Canada, patents in drugs was not a thing. Before TRIPS, I believe our patent term was 17 years. But international, the giant multinationals under the TRIPS, they got it moved to 20 years from date of application. Double check those numbers on me, but that was the thing. That was the package, being okay, we'll be an open dumping ground. You get to keep your tariffs. We keep our tariffs at nothing, but the whole world has to deliver tons of protection for IP. So, but yeah, it was a terrible bargain. And clearly, we've been the sucker all along. Every other country is able to for some reason negotiate price controls, and we don't get to. And what ends up happening is the American consumer is subsidizing for the rest of the world, and it's an untenable situation. So yeah, that's what's going on. But look, I'm not embracing this 301 action with a ton of enthusiasm, because I don't. Like we just said, Andrew, you said it perfectly about chasing exports it's failed. I mean, Henry Clay, this is what he spoke about. And, and in the meantime, we've got so much reshoring to do. And if you're putting tariffs on countries to try to help one company's export profits, then, you're blowing up someone else's American producer supply chain. And so Yeah, it's a real problem. And I would like to think that we could just, we can deal with this domestically without a lot of collateral damage at home. But we'll see. And I hope it, encourages some hard thinking about our ability to negotiate IP wins in other countries.
Yeah, I think that this highlights a very pressing problem that we have, but it might be the wrong tool to do so. And so at CPA, we're also really pushing for a Section 232 investigation for
Yes.
bringing drugs back to the U.S. and making this a product by product approach to reshore these industries in the U.S., rebuild our manufacturing. And I think that should be a little bit more of our focus. It does highlight this big problem of our research and development subsidizing drug prices across the world. But we've also lost out on this by subsidizing this pricing, but also consequently losing out on the manufacturing side that comes with good paying jobs, good tax revenue for a lot of these communities across the US. The Philadelphia, New Jersey area, for example, these counties used to be richer than Northern Virginia because of drug manufacturing that was there and these great jobs that were provided. And so, but we've lost all of that. We've lost all that to offshoring. And so I think we need to have a tailored approach for these drugs with something like a Section 232 that's product specific
Agreed.
and bring these back to the US. And so I think that that would be a more precise solution, but it's great that these problems are
Yes.
being highlighted nonetheless.
Yes. Well
And
said.
moving on to the final topic is the Southeast Asia and South Korea trade deal roundup. And so the United States has finalized trade agreements with Cambodia and Malaysia and is outlining frameworks for discussions with Vietnam as well. And the basic premise of these terms is that there is a certain level of tariffs that are going to be maintained somewhere in the upper teens, around 19 or 20% on exports from these countries. But there are some potential to reduce these tariffs to zero for certain products. And also Malaysia has agreed not to ban or impose export quotas on rare earths coming to the US. And so, Chuck, I wanted to get your take on, is this a good framework moving forward for a lot of these deals, or are there still flaws with some of these deals that are going to allow dumping in the U.S. or any other things that we should keep in mind as President Trump continues to make deals with additional countries in addition to these ones, or as the framework for countries like Vietnam and Thailand are finalized?
Yeah. So, I want to be mindful of the political realities that the administration operates under. And so, these trade deals are like they're a million times better than everything, any deal that predates them, including during the first Trump administration. So way less damage than prior deals, but there's still a couple. So still, I look at the top level conceptually. They're still sort of wrong in the sense that it's they have schedules, tariff concession schedules. They do, right. So they each deal has got a schedule of concessions, just like everything going back to the GATT, where we pledge lower tariffs, no reciprocal tariffs on thousands of goods, and that's just like that's what that's the old thinking, right? It's okay, well, we'll just agree to these rules and then we'll let the chips fall where they may. And if our last, automotive factory closes, well, so be it. We were just outcompeted. Now, I'm going to immediately capture. So one of the things is it doesn't do that on cars, and it leaves intact the Section 232 processes. So these are like this is really important. This is why I'm saying that they don't do a lot of the damage. They're just sort of conceptually flawed. One thing I'll call out is Boeing has clearly still got a big seat at the table. Boeing has been driving trade policy for decades in America, and they were kind of like the top dog when it came to speaking for U.S. manufacturers. And they really became a big U.S. national champion, which is something in American history we don't really do national champions. The rest of the world does, smaller, certainly smaller countries. But unfortunately, Boeing became our national champion. It's led to I think it's directly responsible for the rot at that company and their fall from grace. Same with General Electric, which was number 2 right behind them. And but I still see evidence of them calling the shots in trade policy. Is that if you look at that Cambodian trade deal that just got released, all of these sensitive products, like we're talking like steel and aluminum goods, um, their Cambodia was given the reciprocal tariff was totally wiped out. It went to zero. If it's being imported for aviation pursuant to the WTO agreement on civil aviation, which is primarily benefits Boeing. So Boeing gets to completely keep its supply chain offshore. And that's encouraged. Now maybe they'll make the agreement that okay, well, this is going to encourage it to source from Cambodia instead of China, and that's a good thing. And my point is like, well, that was the whole argument behind TPP, right? And that was firmly rejected by the president. So, I don't love these EU trade deals, but I also want to acknowledge just how far we've come.
Yeah, and I think that's the perfect takeaway, because when you even look at the Korea deal that was just announced, that there's a lot of progress and a big difference between previous trade deals. For example, the auto tariffs from South Korea are going to be reduced, but they're not going to zero. They're going from 25% to 15%. And this is a similar framework we've seen for the EU deal, for example. We're having this maximum, but also in a way a minimum tariff level for these goods coming into the US, where it's not being negotiated down to zero or a negligible 2% tariff or something like that. We're maintaining this level of protection and this level of protection at around 15% is becoming normalized. Countries are very willing to accept this amidst even greater tariff threats, and just for the main motivation that they want access to the US market. Our market is the biggest one in the world, and all the countries in the world really want this. It's a huge leverage tool that we have. And so I think that this minimum tariff level is being normalized through a lot of these trade agreements. It might not be enough for a lot of sectors, as we've gone through before, and 15% can be helpful, but it's often not enough for a lot of these critical sectors.
Revenue.
Yeah, exactly. It's more of a revenue tariff. And so it's good progress, but I think via Section 232, we'll see a lot of industry and product-specific approaches that will hopefully fill a lot of these gaps and be implemented into a lot of these trade deals and not be exempt from that. And so hopefully we'll see progress like that moving forward.
Yeah. Like it is specifically the quota aspect too, right? Where we're going to be import reliant, but I think that's something that because that 15% is revenue. Like so with the UK deal, I that is something I wish we would have seen more of in these more recent deals. In the UK deal, they got they sent us 96,000 cars in 2024. So with the UK trade deal, they get to send 100,000 cars at 10%, which is better than Europe and Japan and Korea are getting. But we capped them at that. Well, capped them in the sense that anything more than 100,000 cars was a 25% tariff, which is certainly more protective than 15%. Not necessarily protective, and China indeed continues to send us cars. That 25% never slowed them down since 2018. But so hopefully we see more of that. And it's on the automotive. It is because at the end of the day we have got lots of tariffs on auto parts, for example, and we don't ever want to make it where it's more, according to Jim Farley, the CEO of Ford, he says he was calling for 35 to 40%, and he says at 15%, Japanese automakers are going to say it's cheaper for us to, just pay the 15% and assemble the vehicle in Japan with, whatever steel and aluminum we want to use and just send it to America, than versus try to, expand operations in the United States and pay tariffs on the parts. So that is something that I think that the, USTR, International Trade Administration, need to really make sure that they're never allowing that to happen. And I'm afraid, to quote CEO Jim Farley, that on automotive that there is some of that happening.
Yeah, and I think that's a really critical point, that there has to be a limit. Like we can negotiate out certain limits for countries to be able to bring into the U.S. as part of these agreements, but there always has to be a limit. Otherwise, it's going to be abused. It's going to be used for transshipment. If one country has unlimited access at a lower percent, then we're going to see what we saw with Mexico after the USMCA, where a lot of goods from China are rerouted through Mexico and coming into the U.S. duty-free with no limits whatsoever. And so I think a lot of these hard limits, especially limits that are implemented and monitored by U.S. Customs on our side, not just a voluntary agreement from another country, this is what we need moving forward. We need not trade negotiation, we need trade enforcement, and we need trade policy decided on our terms, not on whatever another country wants. And so I think that's the framework we need moving forward, and we'll keep working on that and hopefully see a lot of progress in the upcoming trade deals. But that's it for us today from CPA TV, and this was the Big Three. We'll catch you guys next week.